Don't let me down. You left me waiting here. I said, he said no.
The end was inevitable, but no one expected it to sound quite like this. If Abbey Road was the grand, carefully arranged farewell, Let It Be was the sound of a band unraveling in real time.
Let it be, let it be, let it be.
It was meant to be a return to simplicity, a project that would strip away the layers of studio indulgence and bring the Beatles back to their roots as a rock and roll band. Instead, it became a drawn-out struggle, the cracks in their partnership laid bare, with a final product that felt like a compromise rather than a culmination. It was meant to be back to basics, Paul McCartney later said, but it got taken away from us. No Beatles album is without its defenders. Even at its most fractured, there is something compelling about Let It Be. The glimpses of brilliance, the rawness, the sense of a band still capable of magic despite the internal battles that were pulling them apart. But there is no denying that it is an imperfect work, an album that suffered from indecision, interference, and a lack of unity. The story of Let It Be is a familiar one, tangled in disputes over production choices and track selection, with Phil Spector's grandiose embellishments standing in stark contrast to the band's original vision. McCartney in particular was horrified by the addition of sweeping orchestration to the long and winding road, calling it overblown, and insisting that it was done without his approval.
The long and winding road.
Lennon, in his typically blunt fashion, dismissed the entire album. It was shit, he said. Spector took the shittiest load of badly recorded shit and made something of it. Yet, for all the acrimony, Let It Be was not beyond salvation. The question is not whether it should have been different, history cannot be rewritten, but whether it could have better reflected what the Beatles had intended. A few key changes, both in the track list and in the production choices, might have turned a messy postscript into a record worthy of their legacy. The Beatles had started work on Let It Be, then known as Get Back, with an ambitious plan. There would be no studio trickery, no overdubs, no elaborate arrangements. It would be an album played live, a return to the spirit of their early years, capturing the energy of a band simply making music together. It was, in part, a reaction against the increasingly complex studio productions of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the White Album, both of which had been built on intricate layering and meticulous assembly. But by 1969, the Beatles were no longer the same band that had packed themselves into tiny clubs in Hamburg, surviving on cheap beer and the sheer joy of playing rock and roll. The tensions that had simmered through the White Album sessions had not eased, and the return to a stripped-down approach did not bring them closer together.
Could you just stop playing for a minute, John?
Yes, all right,
I'm trying
Paul.
to talk to you about this arrangement. Thank you.
If anything, it only exposed how far they had drifted apart. The sessions were fraught with disagreements. George Harrison temporarily walked out, frustrated by McCartney's controlling tendencies and the continued dominance of Lennon and McCartney's songwriting partnership.
Maybe for the show, I mean, you could just say George was sick.
No, I mean, if he leaves, he leaves.
But what's the consensus? Do you want to go on with the show and the work?
Yeah, if he doesn't come back by Tuesday, we get clapped in
Lennon, increasingly detached and more invested in his relationship with Yoko Ono, seemed barely interested in the project. McCartney, desperate to hold the band together, pushed on, but his enthusiasm often came across as overbearing. The cameras documenting the sessions for what would become the film Let It Be only made things worse. The Beatles were no longer a gang of brothers, they were four men, tired of each other, struggling to recapture something that had already slipped away. By the time the album was released in May 1970, the Beatles had already ceased to exist as a functioning band. Abbey Road, recorded later but released earlier, had been a controlled effort, a deliberate attempt to go out on a high note. Let It Be, however, arrived as an afterthought, a project that no one seemed particularly eager to claim. It was patched together from the original Get Back sessions, with Phil Spector brought in to salvage the material, and yet, for all its flaws, the raw material was there for something greater. some of the strongest songs from the Let It Be sessions were inexplicably left off the album. The most egregious omission was Don't Let Me Down, a song that stands among Lennon's most emotionally direct compositions.
Don't let me down.
It had been played during the famous rooftop concert, yet it was relegated to a B-side, while lesser tracks such as Maggie May and Dig It made the final cut. Harrison, too, was given little room to shine. By this point, he had emerged as a songwriter fully capable of standing alongside Lennon and McCartney. His exclusion from Let It Be is particularly glaring given the quality of material he had available. Old Brown Shoe, released as a B-side to the ballad of John and Yoko, would have provided a much-needed contrast to the softer, more introspective moments on the album. And then there was the ballad of John and Yoko itself, a song that, despite its autobiographical nature, fit perfectly within the Get Back ethos. It was recorded quickly, with only Lennon and McCartney present, but it carried the spontaneous energy that the album so often lacked.
You know it ain't easy. You know how hard it can be.
If Let It Be was to truly embody the spirit of its original conception, it needed both a more considered tracklist and a production approach that reflected the band as they were, rather than how Spector imagined them to be. The first step would be reinstating the songs that should never have been left off. Don't Let Me Down belongs at the heart of the album, not as an afterthought. Old Brown Shoe deserves its place, giving Harrison a stronger voice and breaking up the McCartney-Lennon dynamic.
Escape from this zoo. Hey, I'm in love with you.
The sequencing too could have been improved. If the album had retained its original Get Back title, then it should have opened with Get Back itself, an immediate driving statement of intent. Two of Us, a song that already feels like a farewell, would have been better suited to a later position, giving the album a stronger narrative arc. And then there is The Long and Winding Road. McCartney's original arrangement, stripped of Spector's strings, is far more in keeping with the band's intended sound. The orchestration, for all its grandeur, feels out of place on an album that was meant to be about directness and simplicity. McCartney himself later released Let It Be, naked, an attempt to restore the record to something closer to its intended form. It was, he admitted, a way of undoing what he saw as Spector's meddling. Even if Let It Be had been assembled differently, it would never have been Abbey Road. It was not an album made by a band at peace with each other, but by a group that had already begun to drift apart. By the time it was released, the Beatles were finished. McCartney had announced his departure, Lennon had mentally checked out long before that, and Harrison and Starr were both eager to move on. But there is a case to be made that Let It Be, as flawed as it is, captures something that no other Beatles album does. It is the sound of a band at the edge of collapse, still capable of brilliance, still pushing through the fractures to create something memorable. It does not have the polish of Abbey Road or the conceptual unity of Sgt. Pepper, but it has an undeniable honesty. There is an alternate version of Let It Be that could have been a more fitting farewell, one that was truer to the band's original vision, one that restored the missing pieces and allowed the songs to breathe. But perhaps that is missing the point. Let It Be is what it is precisely because it came at the moment when the Beatles could no longer hold themselves together. It is the sound of a band that had already said its goodbyes, even if the final words had not yet been spoken.